One of the greatest features of American government is that we have baked into our system these guarantees of individual rights. But we need to decide where the limits to those individual rights are and how those apply to the public good. So first, let's look at what are our unalienable rights. So these are rights that, at least according to John Locke and then, later Thomas Jefferson borrowed this idea, these are rights that are impossible to take away. And you can find at least Jefferson's list of these unalienable rights in our Declaration of Independence, which starts off that we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, and that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Now, Jefferson changed Locke's original ideas and adopted this pursuit of happiness idea. John Locke would have said that life, liberty, and property would have been the three unalienable rights. Jefferson changed that a bit to be the pursuit of happiness, but essentially meaning that you're able to pursue the accumulation of property and wealth, and while also having a right to your life and your liberty, liberty being your freedoms. But it's not as simple as individual freedoms versus the power of the government when we're talking about these limits. In some cases, the government is there to step in and protect individual rights. This often happens for minority groups or others that are being discriminated against by the majority. The government's role sometimes is to step in and protect those individual rights. So it's not always about the government limiting our individual freedoms. Sometimes those need protected. However, many times these unalienable rights that Jefferson described can come into conflict with the government or actions that the government takes. You can look at examples of there are times that the government will use eminent domain to seize property that it needs to build a road through someone's property. That road may benefit the public good overall, but it's going to limit that person's individual rights to own that land because they're going to lose some of that land when the road comes through. But sometimes those are decisions that have to be made of the balance between the public good and individual rights. And it's key to remember that unalienable, meaning that these should be rights guaranteed for all people, does not mean that these rights are absolute. Unalienable does not mean that someone has the right to do anything they want to do. Why is that the case? If you think about that for a second, there has to be limits even on somebody's speech or somebody's actions, because they can't be allowed to do whatever they want, or you have really no series of rules or laws at that point. And this is because your actions affect other people. So your actions may limit someone else's rights, and so we've got to find out where that balance is. There are examples of this. The probably most well-known quote comes from Justice Holmes, who spelled out the basic guidelines are, "The right to swing my fist ends where the other man's nose begins." So up until you actually hit that person's nose, you haven't violated anyone's rights. Now, you might say by starting to swing at someone, you've probably threatened them, and that probably has limited their rights. But just think of this as that I'm doing what I want, I'm moving around, and I'm in my individual space. But once I hit someone, I've affected their individual rights. I've affected their freedom by assaulting them. And so that's where my rights have ended. Now I've violated someone else's rights, and something needs to step in to limit my actions at that point. So it's this balance between individual rights, the common good, and governmental power. Sometimes government kind of gets in the way over here and will serve as a barrier between the common good and individual rights. And that could work either way. Sometimes it's to protect individuals or minorities from actions of the majority. Sometimes it's to limit individuals in name of protecting the common good. Let's look at a concrete example of this, a Supreme Court case you will see in your lessons. This is Snyder v. Phelps, a case from 2011. This involves an organization called the Westboro Baptist Church, whose leader's last name is Phelps, so that's where the Phelps comes from in the case. And they go around and protest at different events, but one of the things they protest at are at military funerals. And they do have some pretty horrible signs that they hold up, saying that these soldiers and people deserve to die. They believe that God hates the United States because it is tolerant towards and protects the rights of members of the LGBTQ community. They believe that God is punishing the United States, and that's why we have these military deaths. They protested at a funeral for Matthew Snyder, who was a soldier killed in Iraq, and the soldier's father took the church to court, saying that the actions of the Westboro Baptist Church was intentionally inflicting emotional distress on the family. He didn't think they should be able to protest and cause this stress to his family. He felt like their actions were violating his rights towards liberty and the freedom to grieve over his son's death, and the family to have that freedom to kind of have that privacy. So this is where the Supreme Court steps in and looks at this case, because now the court has to balance these two considerations. Now, I think immediately most of us would side with the family in this case, because they're going through a terrible tragedy, and they shouldn't have to hear these horrible things that the Westboro Baptist Church is saying and protesting at the funeral. But we have to take a step back. Imagine we're putting on the robes to be a Supreme Court justice, and we have to look at the larger picture here. Do we want to limit what the Westboro Baptist Church can say just because we don't agree with it? What happens if we start then applying that to lots of other speech that people give, and you would say, oh, I don't agree with that, they shouldn't be allowed to say that. Suddenly the First Amendment is much weaker if the court had ruled with Snyder's father. So even though you might not agree with what the Westboro Baptist Church is saying, or you might agree with it, either way, the court was saying that speech is protected, it's part of their beliefs, falls under freedom of speech, freedom of religion, and their ability to express their views, even though it was causing that stress for the family. So the keys to remember here are that your individual rights are not absolute. Do not feel like freedom of speech means you have the freedom to say whatever you want. Freedom of speech protects speech that is criticizing the government from the government punishing you for that speech. So it does not mean you can say whatever you want without any consequences. And this is because you have to balance the common good, the right of the public overall, with the individual rights. And if you don't have that balance and you side too much with the public good, you're restricting individual freedoms. If you side too much with individual freedoms to do whatever you want, regardless of how it affects other people, you have chaos. So the Supreme Court's role is often to decide where that line should be drawn. That's a balance that you'll see in lots of different court cases that we'll look at in Unit 2 and throughout this semester. If you have any questions about this, definitely reach out to your government teacher. And thanks for watching.